porcelain bolted rigidly to a wooden pin would be... It's October 1896 on a dirt road running between Niagara Falls and Buffalo, New York. A lineman named Walter Heinz is climbing a 40-foot wooden pole with iron spikes strapped to his boots. Below him, a wagon loaded with glass insulators waits in the mud. Heinz's job is simple, on paper. Bolt a wooden crossarm to the top of the pole. Screw a glass insulator onto an iron pin sticking up from that crossarm. Loop a copper wire over the top of the glass and tie it down with smaller wire. Climb down, move to the next pole. Repeat this 1,400 times between the falls and the city of Buffalo, 20-some miles away. The wire he's stringing will carry 11,000 volts, 5 times more electrical pressure than anything that had ever been sent over a wire that distance before. Everyone working the line that fall accepts that some of these glass insulators will crack in the cold, some will be shot out by hunters, and a few will simply explode without warning during a storm. The crews carry spares in every wagon, because replacing insulators is just part of the job, like changing a flat tire. But this wasn't normal. Within 15 years, the entire method Heinz was using, glass, was recognized across the American electrical industry as a dead end. Not an inconvenience, a hard physical wall that no amount of bigger glass or thicker porcelain could ever push past. And the part that broke through that wall wasn't built by a famous inventor in a famous laboratory. It was built by a 30-year-old engineer in Barberton, Ohio, and it weighed about as much as a paperback book.
To understand why Heinz's glass insulators were a problem, you have to understand what they were actually doing. An insulator's job is to hold a high-voltage wire away from a grounded pole without letting electricity jump the gap. The wire is hot, the pole is wood, and wood touching wet earth is, electrically speaking, the same as touching the ground directly. The insulator is the only thing standing between a live wire and a dead short. For the first 20 years of commercial electric power in America, this wasn't a hard problem. Thomas Edison's direct current systems, built starting in 1882 in Lower Manhattan, ran at around 110 volts and rarely needed to travel more than a mile from the generating station. At that voltage, a small pin-mounted glass insulator, the same basic design used on telegraph lines since the 1840s, did the job fine. The trouble started with alternating current. AC could be stepped up to high voltage using a transformer, pushed over long distances with much less power lost to resistance in the wire, then stepped back down for use in homes and factories. George Westinghouse proved this commercially in 1896 when the Niagara Falls Power Company sent 11,000 volts to Buffalo, roughly 22 miles away. It worked. It also revealed a new problem nobody had fully reckoned with. The insulator itself had to physically grow to handle that voltage, and pin-type insulators could only grow so much before the design broke down.
Here's the engineering reality crews like Heinz's were up against, even if most of them couldn't have explained it in those terms. A pin insulator works by mounting solid porcelain or glass directly on top of a metal pin, which is itself bolted to a wooden crossarm. As voltage increases, you need more insulating material, more glass, more porcelain, to prevent the current from arcing across the surface in wet or dirty conditions. But every inch you add to the insulator also adds leverage. The insulator isn't just resisting electrical stress anymore. It's resisting the mechanical stress of wind, ice, and the sheer weight of the wire, all transmitted through a single rigid pin. By the time voltages climbed towards 60,000 and 70,000 volts in the early 1900s, the math stopped working. Engineers calculated that a 4-part pin insulator rated for 60,000 volts needed a top shelf roughly 16 inches across and weighed more than 30 pounds, all balanced on a 16 to 20-inch pin acting as a lever arm. Under wind load, that lever arm put enormous strain on a single point of failure, the porcelain-to-pin joint. Utility engineers of the era described reaching the limit of the pin-supported type in plain terms, not a design choice, but a wall. 5 forces kept the industry stuck behind that wall for nearly 15 years. First, the manufacturing base was built around pin insulators. Companies like Hemingway Glass and the early Ohio Brass Company, founded in Mansfield, Ohio in 1888, had tooling, molds, and decades of know-how invested in the pin design, and retooling for something unproven was expensive. Second, electrical demand was rising faster than insulator science. Utilities needed parts now, not after years of redesign. Third,
The industry initially tried to solve the problem by making pin insulators bigger and more complex, adding extra porcelain shells rather than rethinking the basic geometry. Fourth, voltage records were being set in a competitive rush, with companies like Westinghouse and General Electric racing to win contracts, leaving little institutional appetite to pause and rebuild from scratch. Fifth, and most simply, nobody in the industry had yet proven that an alternative actually worked at scale, so the incentive to gamble on something new was low. So crews adapted instead of fixing the underlying problem. Linemen carried spare insulators by the dozen. Utilities budgeted for routine flashovers and outages as a cost of doing business. Storm season meant expected line failures, not surprising ones. The pin insulator wasn't seen as broken, it was seen as expensive, fragile, and simply the price of having electricity at all.
The crisis point. The wall stopped being theoretical around 1900 when American utilities began racing past 60,000 volts to feed growing industrial demand, particularly around hydroelectric sites like Niagara Falls, where cheap power was driving new aluminum smelting and chemical plants. Pin insulators rated for these higher voltages weren't just expensive anymore, they were becoming physically absurd, requiring shells over a foot wide, mounted on crossarms that had to be reinforced just to carry the dead weight. The real pressure point was Niagara Falls itself. In 1893, the Ontario Power Company had been awarded a generating contract with Westinghouse, with transmission and transformer work going to General Electric, to build a far more ambitious line than the original 1896 Buffalo Run. This new project, completed in 1909, was designed to carry power at 110,000 volts, 10 times the voltage of the original Buffalo line just 13 years earlier, and the first transmission line in North America to reach that level. At 110,000 volts, pin-type insulators weren't an option at all. No reasonable pin-mounted design could survive that electrical stress without becoming so large and so heavy that no wooden crossarm, and arguably no tower, could support it economically. Utility engineers were blunt about the math. Continuing to scale up the old design would mean insulators weighing tens of pounds each, multiplied across thousands of poles, adding catastrophic cost and weight to a transmission system already pushing the limits of what was buildable. This wasn't an abstract engineering puzzle anymore. It was a contract with a deadline, a hydroelectric project worth millions of dollars, and a real possibility that the entire 110,000-volt plan could stall because nobody had solved the basic problem of how to hang a wire from a pole at that voltage without the hardware collapsing under its own design requirements. The companies supplying insulators for this project, and for the wave of high-voltage lines expected to follow it across the country, needed an answer that didn't just nudge the pin insulator forward, but replaced it outright. Introducing the solver. The man who answered that need was Arthur O. Austin, an engineer working at the Ohio Brass Company's plant in Barberton, Ohio, a small industrial town outside Akron. Austin was around 30 years old in the years leading up to his key patents. Not a celebrated scientist with a university laboratory, but a working engineer inside a hardware manufacturing company that made brass and porcelain fittings for the electrical industry. By most accounts, Austin was methodical rather than flashy, the kind of engineer who spent his career inside one company, steadily filing patents and improvements rather than chasing public recognition. Over his working life, he would eventually be credited with 34 separate inventions or major developments related to high-voltage hardware. Almost all of it unglamorous, practical equipment, insulator hardware, testing apparatus, protective devices. His daily work put him directly in contact with the problem utilities were facing. Ohio Brass made insulator hardware, which meant Austin's job involved understanding exactly why the existing pin and shell designs were failing under increasing voltage, and what physically happened to porcelain, cement, and metal fittings under mechanical and electrical stress. He wasn't approaching the insulator problem as an outsider with a clever idea. He was approaching it as someone who had likely seen failed insulators come back to the plant, cracked and arced, and had to figure out why. What set Austin apart wasn't a single flash of genius. It was a willingness to question the basic geometry of the pin insulator itself. Not how to make it bigger or stronger, but whether the entire concept of stacking insulation rigidly on a pin was the wrong approach for high voltage altogether. The most obvious response to rising voltage was simply scaling the existing design up.
manufacturers added more porcelain shells, stacked vertically, to increase the surface distance current would have to travel to arc over. This worked, in a narrow sense. It did increase voltage resistance, but it also multiplied weight and wind resistance on a single rigid pin. And at 60,000 volts and above, the insulators became so heavy and top-heavy that they risked snapping their own mounting hardware in ordinary wind. The fix made the original mechanical weakness worse, not better. Engineers tried compensating for the growing weight and leverage problem by strengthening the wooden crossarms and using heavier iron pins. This addressed the symptom, but not the cause. A bigger pin could hold a bigger insulator in place under static conditions, but it did nothing to solve the underlying issue. Any rigid, single-point mounting system concentrates all the mechanical stress from wind, ice, and wire tension onto one joint. Reinforcing the pin just meant the next failure point moved somewhere else in the assembly, usually the porcelain itself cracking near the base. Some engineers, including designers working for the Niagara Falls Power Company as early as 1901, experimented with underhung insulator designs, hanging insulating elements below the crossarm rather than mounting them rigidly on top. These early efforts, including patents filed around the original Niagara installations, hinted at the right idea: distributing mechanical load instead of concentrating it. But these early versions were often one-off, custom designs, expensive to manufacture, inconsistent in quality, and not standardized in any way that could be mass-produced reliably across an entire transmission line, let alone sold to utilities nationwide. Each failed attempt taught the same lesson from a different angle. The problem wasn't strength, it was geometry. As long as insulating material was loaded rigidly, in tension or compression at a single fixed point, it would eventually fail at scale. Something needed to change about how the wire's weight moved through the insulator altogether. A 25-cent porcelain disc solved a multi-million-dollar engineering problem. On January 25, 1910, Arthur O. Austin filed a patent, U.S. Patent 947274, for a suspension insulator built around a fundamentally different idea. Instead of one large piece of porcelain rigidly mounted on a pin, use a series of small, identical, interlocking discs, each one connected to the next by a metal cap and pin joint, hanging freely below the crossarm like a chain. The design was deceptively simple. Each disc was relatively small and cheap to manufacture, similar in basic shape to a porcelain plate. A metal cap was cemented to the top of each disc, and a metal pin was cemented to the bottom of the disc above it. These caps and pins interlocked, so discs could be strung together. One disc for low-voltage applications, 6 discs for 66,000 volts, more discs for higher voltages still, into what engineers called an insulator string. This solved the mechanical problem immediately. Because the string hung freely from the crossarm rather than being rigidly fixed, it could swing slightly under wind load instead of transmitting all of that force into a single brittle joint. The weight of the wire pulled the string straight down, in tension, which porcelain handles far better than the bending and leverage forces a rigid pin insulator endured. If one disc in the string cracked, the rest of the string often kept functioning, buying crews time to make a scheduled repair instead of facing a sudden total failure. It also solved the manufacturing problem. Because every disc in the string was identical, Ohio Brass and its competitors could mass-produce a single standardized unit instead of custom casting different insulator sizes for every voltage class a utility might need. Need more voltage on a line? Add more discs to the string. No new mold, no new design, no new tooling. The economics were transformative. A part that individually cost a fraction of what a single large pin insulator cost could be combined in bulk into assemblies that outperformed anything the old design could achieve at any voltage. Why did nobody think of it earlier? In a narrow sense, someone had. The underhung experiments around Niagara in 1901 pointed at the same basic principle. But Austin's version, refined through his work at Ohio Brass and protected under a patent that, according to later industry summaries, ended up covering a large share of the suspension insulators used for decades afterward, was the first to combine the right geometry with genuine manufacturing standardization. It turned an experimental idea into a part any utility in the country could order, install, and trust. The suspension insulator scaled nationwide for the same reason any good piece of infrastructure scales. It was cheaper, more reliable, and required no special skill to install correctly. Linemen could string a disc chain almost as fast as they'd bolted on the old glass shells. Impact and forgetting. By the 1910s and 1920s, the suspension insulator had become the default standard for any American transmission line above roughly 33,000 volts, the threshold where pin insulators stopped being economical. Ohio Brass, the small Barberton hardware company Austin worked for, grew into one of the dominant names in high-voltage insulator manufacturing for much of the 20th century, eventually becoming part of the Hubbell Power Systems family of brands. The economic impact was straightforward, but enormous in scale. Every mile of high-voltage transmission line built in America after 1910, and there would eventually be hundreds of thousands of miles of it, depended on some version of the cap-and-disc principle Austin patented. The rural electrification efforts of the 1930s, the post-war expansion of the national power grid, and the long-distance lines that eventually let power move from hydroelectric dams in the Pacific Northwest to cities hundreds of miles away, all relied on insulator strings descended directly from his design.
The human impact is harder to put a number on, but it mattered just as much. Linemen like Walter Heinz, who once carried spare glass insulators because failures were routine, worked on systems that became measurably more reliable. Utilities stopped budgeting for predictable storm season insulator failures as a basic cost of doing business. Power outages caused by insulator failure, once an accepted nuisance, became rare enough to be notable when they happened. Austin himself never became a household name. He continued working at Ohio Brass for decades, eventually running the company's high-voltage testing laboratory in Barberton, where he generated artificial lightning strikes up to 900,000 volts to test insulator designs against real-world conditions. He died in 1964, credited with 34 inventions, almost none of which the public would ever recognize by name, despite the fact that nearly every transmission tower in the country was, in some sense, holding up his idea. History forgot the suspension insulator for the same reason it forgets most genuinely successful engineering. It worked too well to stay interesting. A part that fails dramatically gets remembered. A part that quietly does its job, disc after disc, mile after mile, decade after decade, disappears into the landscape, technically present on every transmission tower in America, but functionally invisible to everyone who benefits from it. The best engineering becomes invisible.
Thanks for watching, and don't forget, like and subscribe for more videos.